In the middle of a bustling marketplace in the American West, it was not the sound of banjos or clinking wine glasses that echoed through the air, but the horrifying call of human auctioneers. Two young Apache women, hands bound tight with rough rope, eyes wide with terror, were dragged onto a wooden platform like merchandise before a bloodthirsty, alcohol-soaked crowd. A drunken white man laughed uproariously, swaying as he waved a leather pouch full of coins, demanding to purchase them as if they were livestock. The crowd roared with laughter, no one objecting to the grotesque spectacle unfolding before them. No one, except for one ordinary man. He rose to his feet, his eyes blazing with righteous fury. In that moment, the entire square fell silent. Would this lone individual dare to confront an entire mob? And that decision would change the fate of the two Apache sisters forever. The frontier town of Millfield sat like a festering wound on the edge of civilization, where lawlessness masqueraded as freedom and brutality passed for entertainment. It was 1867, and the Indian Wars had left deep scars across the landscape and even deeper ones in the hearts of men. The recent completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had brought waves of newcomers. Fortune seekers, clutching maps to imaginary gold mines, drifters running from past mistakes, gamblers with marked cards and loaded dice, and those who profited from human misery in all its forms. The town itself bore the harsh marks of rapid, unplanned growth. Wooden storefronts lined the main street like crooked teeth, their paint already peeling under the relentless prairie Sunday. Between legitimate businesses selling supplies to travelers and settlers, darker enterprises flourished in the shadows. Saloons stayed open 24 hours a day, card games ran continuously in back rooms, and women who had fallen on desperate times sold whatever they had left to sell. Among all these moral compromises, the trade in human beings represented the deepest descent into barbarism, one that decent folks preferred not to acknowledge, but secretly enabled through their willful blindness and convenient silence. The territorial government, such as it was, maintained only the thinnest veneer of authority. The nearest federal marshal was 200 miles away, and local law enforcement consisted of whoever was willing to pin on a badge and face down the rough characters who called Millfield home. Justice, when it existed at all, was often administered at the end of a rope by whoever could assemble the largest mob. In such an environment, the strong preyed upon the weak with virtual impunity, and those without power or protection found themselves at the mercy of men who possessed neither conscience nor constraint. The two Apache women had been captured 3 days earlier during a brutal raid on their peaceful village along the Gila River. Sarah Running Deer, barely 20 years old, had been helping her grandmother prepare traditional foods for the winter when the soldiers and civilian volunteers attacked without warning. The raid was supposedly in retaliation for cattle theft, though no evidence of such crimes had ever been presented. In truth, it was simply another excuse to displace the Apache from lands that white settlers coveted. Sarah held her younger sister Mary close as they huddled together on the rough wooden planks, their bodies bearing the marks of the forced march that had brought them to this place of horrors. Their traditional clothing, intricately beaded and sewn with patterns that told the story of their family lineage, had been torn and soiled during their capture and subsequent abuse. Their long black hair, once carefully braided with sacred ornaments, now hung disheveled around their faces like dark curtains of despair. Sarah's dark eyes, which had once sparkled with laughter as she played with the children of her village, now darted across the jeering faces in the crowd, searching desperately for any sign of mercy or humanity. She found none among the sea of cruel faces that regarded her and her sister as objects rather than human beings. Mary, only 16, and still learning the traditional ways of their people, trembled uncontrollably. Her small frame pressed against her sister for whatever comfort could be found in this waking nightmare. The sisters came from a proud lineage of Apache women who had faced adversity with dignity and courage for countless generations. Their grandmother had survived the forced relocation attempts of the 1850s. Their mother had endured the constant threat of cavalry raids throughout their childhood. They had been raised with stories of strength and resilience, taught that Apache women were the backbone of their people's survival. But nothing in their cultural preparation had readied them for the dehumanizing horror of being displayed like livestock before a crowd of strangers who saw them as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. The makeshift auction block had been erected in the town square, where normally farmers sold their produce and craftsmen displayed their wares. Today, it served a far more sinister purpose. A crude banner hung overhead, advertising the sale of Indian captives as if it were a livestock auction. The crowd that gathered was a mixture of rough frontier types, cattlemen with weathered faces, miners still bearing the dust of their claims, and townspeople who had come to witness the spectacle with the morbid curiosity of those who had grown numb to suffering. Among them stood Daniel Morrison, a carpenter who had arrived in Millfield just 2 months earlier, seeking nothing more than honest work and a chance to start fresh after a series of personal tragedies had driven him west. He was 34 years old, of average height and build, with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard labor and craftsmanship. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen both the best and worst of human nature, though until this moment he had always managed to convince himself that the worst was none of his concern. Daniel had grown up in Ohio, the son of a Methodist minister who preached about justice and compassion but who had somehow failed to prepare his son for the moral complexities of frontier life. The death of Daniel's wife and infant daughter from cholera 3 years earlier had shattered his faith in divine providence and left him adrift in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to suffering. He had come west, not seeking adventure or fortune, but simply trying to outrun grief and guilt that followed him like persistent shadows. In his travels across the frontier, Daniel had witnessed injustice in various forms. He had seen Chinese workers treated like expendable machines during railroad construction, watched Mexican families driven from lands their ancestors had owned for generations, observed the systematic destruction of Native American communities in the name of progress and manifest destiny. Each time, he had kept his head down, minded his own business, told himself that one man could not change the world, and that survival required focusing on one's own problems rather than taking on the burdens of strangers. This philosophy of deliberate indifference had served him well enough, keeping him out of trouble and allowing him to move from town to town without complication or confrontation. He had developed the frontier settler's essential skill of selective blindness, the ability to see only what was convenient to see and ignore everything that might demand moral action or personal risk. It was a survival mechanism that allowed decent people to function in indecent times, but it came at the cost of something essential to the human soul. But as Daniel watched the two young women being displayed like cattle before the bloodthirsty crowd, something deep within him began to stir, like a sleeping bear awakened by an unexpected sound. Perhaps it was the memory of his own sister Martha, who had died of fever when she was Mary's age, her hand clutching his, as she whispered her fears about what would happen to their family without her. Perhaps it was the accumulation of all the small injustices he had witnessed and ignored over the years, each one adding weight to a burden that had finally become unbearable. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever, regardless of the consequences or the cost. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Bart Sullivan who made his living facilitating such transactions, called for attention. His voice carried across the square with practiced authority, treating the sale of human beings as routine business. He began to describe the merchandise with the same detached professionalism he might use for horses or cattle, listing their perceived attributes and potential uses with callous efficiency. It was then that Jake Brennan stumbled forward from the crowd, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and his clothes stained with tobacco juice and other substances too vile to identify. Brennan was known throughout the territory as a man of violent appetites and unlimited cruelty, a creature who had long ago surrendered any claim to human decency in favor of the raw exercise of power over those weaker than himself. He owned a sprawling ranch 50 miles south of town, an isolated compound where rumors circulated about the fate of previous acquisitions that never seemed to last long in his employ and were never seen again once they disappeared behind his gates. His reputation preceded him wherever he went like the stench of rotting meat, and decent folks crossed the street to avoid his attention. Even hardened frontier types, men who had killed and stolen and committed acts they preferred not to remember, gave Brennan a wide berth. There was something fundamentally wrong with him, something that went beyond mere criminality into realms of evil that most people could not comprehend or confront. Brennan's appearance matched his reputation. He was a large man gone to fat, his once powerful frame now bloated by years of excess and degeneracy. His face was permanently flushed from alcohol, his small eyes sunken deep in pouches of swollen flesh. His mouth, when it opened to speak, revealed teeth stained brown from tobacco and rotted from neglect. Everything about him suggested corruption and decay, as if his moral putrefaction had begun to manifest itself in his physical form. Behind Brennan came his usual entourage of sycophants and hangers-on, men who attached themselves to power regardless of its nature because they lacked the courage or ability to stand on their own. They laughed at his crude jokes, applauded his cruelties, and enabled his worst impulses in exchange for scraps from his table and protection from his wrath. Among them were drifters and deserters, men with prices on their heads and others who had committed crimes so vile that even frontier justice would not tolerate them. Brennan raised his leather pouch high above his head, coins jingling inside like the rattle of a serpent's tail as he swayed unsteadily on his feet. His voice, slurred but loud enough for all to hear, cut through the morning air like a rusty blade dragged across stone. He announced his intention to purchase both women, describing in crude and graphic terms exactly what purposes they would serve on his ranch, what entertainments he had planned for them, and how long he expected them to survive his attentions. The crowd erupted in laughter and crude cheers, treating his vile proclamation as entertainment rather than the declaration of intent to commit horrific crimes that it truly was. Men who might consider themselves decent human beings in other circumstances found themselves caught up in the mob mentality, their moral compasses spinning wildly in the magnetic field of collective cruelty. Women looked away or giggled nervously, complicit in their silence, while children watched with wide eyes that would carry these images into their own adulthood. Daniel felt his stomach churn as Brennan's words washed over him like a tide of human sewage. The carpenter's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of horror and disbelief. Around him, men who considered themselves civilized laughed and applauded as if they were watching a theatrical performance rather than witnessing the preparation for torture and murder. Women looked away with practiced indifference, as if by not acknowledging the horror they could absolve themselves of complicity in what was about to occur. But it was not just the immediate threat to Sarah and Mary that caused Daniel's blood to boil. It was the sudden, crystalline understanding of how this moment had come to pass, how a series of small compromises and willful blindnesses had created an environment where such evil could flourish openly. Every person in that crowd who laughed or remained silent was complicit. Every voice that did not cry out in protest was a vote in favor of barbarism over civilization. Daniel's mind raced as he watched the auctioneer resume his practiced patter, treating the sale of human flesh as routine commerce. How many other Sarah and Marys had stood on that same platform? How many had disappeared into the darkness of men like Brennan while decent people told themselves it was none of their business? How many times had evil triumphed simply because good people chose convenience over courage? The weight of his own complicity pressed down on Daniel like a physical burden. In 2 months in Millfield, he had heard whispered stories about the auction block, had seen evidence of the trade in human misery that flourished in the shadows of the frontier town. But he had chosen not to investigate, not to ask questions, not to involve himself in matters that might complicate his simple desire for a quiet life and honest work. His silence had been purchased with the coin of willful ignorance, and now he was being forced to confront the true price of that bargain. The auctioneer began the bidding with callous efficiency, starting with an amount that valued human lives less than a decent horse or a good rifle. His voice carried the practiced indifference of a man who had conducted such sales many times before, in many different towns, always moving on before the consequences of his actions could catch up with him. He was a facilitator of evil, a middleman who profited from human suffering while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a businessman responding to market demands. Brennan immediately countered with a higher offer, clearly determined to secure his prize regardless of cost. His bid was not just financial but also social, a demonstration of his power and status in the community. By publicly purchasing human beings for his own gratification, he was asserting his place in the hierarchy of frontier society, showing that his money and reputation gave him license to commit acts that would be crimes in more civilized places. Other voices joined in the bidding, turning the sale of 2 innocent young women into a competitive sport. Some bid out of genuine interest in acquiring the women for their own purposes, others simply to drive up the price and increase Brennan's cost. A few seemed to bid for the sheer entertainment value, treating the auction as an extension of the gambling and spectacle that defined much of frontier recreation. With each bid, Daniel felt something breaking inside him, a dam of accumulated guilt and suppressed conscience finally reaching its breaking point. The voices of his past echoed in his memory. His father's sermons about standing up for the oppressed, his wife's gentle insistence that good people had obligations to their community, his sister's dying words about the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. All the moral teachings of his youth, suppressed and ignored during years of frontier pragmatism, came rushing back with the force of a river bursting through a weakened levee. Sarah Running Deer stood as tall as her bonds would allow, her chin raised in defiance even as tears traced silent paths down her dirt-stained cheeks. Drawing upon the strength of countless generations of Apache women who had faced death with dignity, she began to sing in her native tongue, her voice rising above the crude laughter of the crowd like smoke from a sacred fire. It was a death song passed down through generations of Apache women who had faced similar fates, a melody that spoke of courage in the face of unspeakable evil and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be erased. The song was more than mere sound. It was a prayer, a declaration, and a final act of defiance, all woven together in haunting harmonies that seemed to reach into the very souls of those who heard it. Sarah sang of the mountain homes of her people, of the sacred places where her ancestors had lived and died, of the children who would remember her name even after her body had returned to the earth. She sang of the eagle that soars above the peaks, untouchable and free, and of the ancient oak that bends in the storm but never breaks. Mary joined her sister's song, their voices harmonizing in a melody that transcended language and culture, speaking directly to the universal human capacity for both suffering and transcendence. Though Mary was younger and more frightened, her voice carried its own power, the clear, sweet tone of youth that had not yet been broken by the world's cruelty. Together, the sisters created a sound that was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in its darkest hour. The death song was not one of surrender or despair, but of preparation and acceptance. It acknowledged the likelihood of their fate while asserting their refusal to be diminished by it. In the Apache tradition, how one faced death was more important than death itself. A warrior who died with courage and dignity achieved a form of immortality, their spirit joining the eternal community of ancestors who watched over the living. Sarah and Mary were preparing for that journey, transforming their terror into something approaching peace. The song seemed to cast a spell over the gathering, momentarily silencing even the most hardened spectators. The crude laughter died away, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet as the crowd was forced to confront the humanity of the two women they had been treating as objects. For a brief instant, the carefully maintained fiction that these were somehow less than human collapsed under the weight of their obvious dignity and courage. In the sudden quiet, other sounds became audible. The creaking of wagon wheels as late arrivals pushed closer to see the spectacle, the nervous pawing of horses tied at the hitching posts, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. But dominating everything was the sisters' song, rising and falling like the wind through canyon walls, beautiful and terrible and utterly heartbreaking in its quiet acceptance of approaching doom. It was in that moment of profound clarity that Daniel Morrison made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the sudden quiet like thunder after lightning. He did not shout or rant, but spoke with a clarity and conviction that commanded attention from every person in the square. He challenged not just Brennan's bid, but the entire premise of the auction itself. He spoke of the women's humanity, of the moral bankruptcy of a society that would treat fellow human beings as property to be bought and sold. His words were simple but powerful, drawn not from education or eloquence, but from a deep well of human decency that had finally found its voice. The crowd's reaction was immediate and hostile. Catcalls and jeers erupted from every direction, with many questioning Daniel's right to interfere in what they considered legitimate business. Brennan himself turned his bleary gaze toward this unexpected challenger, his alcohol-fogged brain slowly processing the insult to his plans. Daniel stood his ground, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He was outnumbered 50 to 1, facing men who would not hesitate to resort to violence to preserve their twisted version of order. But retreat was no longer possible. Not when two innocent lives hung in the balance. Not when his own soul demanded that he finally take a stand for what was right. Brennan staggered toward Daniel, his friends and associates forming a loose circle around them. The drunk man's face was flushed with anger and alcohol, his speech becoming even more slurred as he berated this stranger who dared to interfere with his plans. He accused Daniel of being an Indian lover, a troublemaker, a man who did not understand how things worked on the frontier. Daniel's response was measured but firm. He explained that he understood exactly how things worked, and that was precisely the problem. He spoke of law and order, of the difference between civilization and barbarism, of the kind of society they were building with their silence and complicity. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, the power of a man who had finally found his moral center and would not be moved from it. The confrontation escalated quickly. Brennan's companions, equally drunk and equally committed to the auction's success, began to crowd around Daniel with increasingly aggressive postures. Threats were made, both subtle and explicit. The carpenter was warned that outsiders who could not mind their own business often found frontier life to be shorter and more brutal than they had anticipated. But Daniel had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had spent too many years watching injustice unfold while telling himself that someone else would act, that it was not his place to intervene, that one man could not make a difference. Now, faced with evil in its most naked form, he found within himself a reservoir of courage he had never known existed. The first blow came without warning, a sucker punch from one of Brennan's men that sent Daniel staggering backward. Blood flowed from his split lip, but he did not fall. Instead, he straightened, wiped the blood with the back of his hand, and prepared to defend himself against overwhelming odds. What followed was not a fair fight by any measure. Daniel faced 5 men, all of them experienced in frontier violence, all of them motivated by alcohol and the mob mentality that had taken hold of the square. They came at him from multiple directions, using fists and boots and whatever makeshift weapons came to hand. But Daniel Morrison fought with the desperate fury of a man who knew that losing meant more than just his own death. It meant the continuation of an evil system, the purchase of 2 innocent women by a monster, and the triumph of cruelty over compassion. He absorbed punishment that would have felled lesser men, but he kept fighting, kept standing, kept throwing punches with hands that grew bloodier with each exchange. The crowd watched with savage fascination as the battle raged in the dust of the town square. Some cheered for Brennan's men, while others began to watch in uncomfortable silence. A few women in the crowd turned away entirely, unable to witness the brutality unfolding before them. Children were hurried away by parents who suddenly remembered that they had pressing business elsewhere. As the fight continued with brutal intensity, something unexpected began to happen among the spectators. Daniel's courage in the face of impossible odds started to affect the watching crowd in ways that neither he nor his attackers had anticipated. His refusal to back down, his willingness to sacrifice himself for strangers who could offer him nothing in return except the knowledge that he had done the right thing, began to stir consciences that had long been dormant under layers of frontier pragmatism and moral compromise. Murmurs began to spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Whispered conversations about right and wrong, about the kind of town they wanted Millfield to be, about the difference between civilization and barbarism. Some spectators began to shift uncomfortably as they watched Daniel absorb punishment that would have killed lesser men, his blood staining the dust of the town square as he continued to fight against overwhelming odds. The transformation was not immediate or universal. Many in the crowd remained committed to the spectacle, cheering for Brennan's men and calling for Daniel's complete destruction. But others began to experience something they had not felt in years: shame. Shame at their complicity, shame at their silence, shame at the recognition that they were witnessing both the worst and best of human nature and finding themselves on the wrong side of the moral divide. Mrs. Rebecca Sullivan, the schoolteacher who had recently arrived from Boston to bring education to the frontier, stood with her hand pressed to her mouth in horror as she watched the violence unfold. She had seen enough of frontier life to understand that such confrontations were common, but she had never witnessed anything quite like Daniel's solitary stand against an entire system of oppression. Her voice, when she finally found it, cut through the crowd's noise with the clarity of moral authority. She called out against the violence, against the auction, against the entire spectacle that had brought them to this moment. Her words carried weight not just because of her education or social standing, but because they gave voice to thoughts that many in the crowd had been afraid to acknowledge. Other voices began to join hers, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as people realized they were not alone in their revulsion. The tide began to turn when Daniel, bloodied but unbroken, managed to land a powerful blow that sent Brennan himself crashing to the ground like a felled tree. The drunk man's supporters hesitated for just a moment, surprised by their leader's vulnerability and the unexpected resistance of their supposedly easy target. In that moment of hesitation, with Brennan sprawled in the dust and his men uncertain whether to continue the attack, Daniel found his voice again. He spoke through swollen lips and bloodied teeth, his words carrying across the square with crystal clarity despite his physical condition. He challenged every person present to look at themselves, to consider what they were witnessing and what their silence made them complicit in. He spoke of Sarah and Mary not as commodities, but as human beings, as daughters and sisters who deserve protection rather than exploitation, as representatives of all the vulnerable people who depended on the courage of strangers for their survival. His words found their mark in hearts that had been armored against conscience but were now cracking under the pressure of undeniable truth. Several men in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably, their earlier enthusiasm for the spectacle beginning to waver like flames in a strong wind. A few actually stepped forward, not to join the fight but to call for it to stop, their voices adding to the growing chorus of opposition. The mood in the square began to change like storm clouds gathering on a previously clear day, dark and threatening, and charged with electricity. What had seemed like settled business just minutes before now appeared uncertain, the outcome no longer predetermined by superior numbers and mob mentality. The careful balance of power that had allowed evil to flourish was beginning to shift, one voice at a time, one conscience at a time, one act of courage inspiring another. Brennan struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He reached for the gun at his side, crossing the line from fist fight to potentially deadly violence. But before he could draw his weapon, another voice rang out across the square. It was Tom Harrison, the town blacksmith, and one of Millfield's most respected citizens. Harrison was a man of few words but enormous moral authority, someone whose opinion carried weight with both the respectable citizens and the rougher elements of the frontier community. He stepped into the circle, his massive frame and serious demeanor commanding immediate attention. Harrison did not speak of law or justice or civilization. Instead, he spoke of simple human decency, of the kind of men they wanted to be and the kind of legacy they wanted to leave. He reminded the crowd that many of them had wives and daughters at home, and asked them to consider how they would feel if those loved ones faced the fate that awaited Sarah and Mary. His words had an immediate effect. The circle around Daniel began to expand as men stepped backward, no longer comfortable with their proximity to the violence. Some actually began to voice their objections to the auction itself, questioning whether such practices had any place in a community that aspired to be more than a collection of lawless outcasts. Brennan, still swaying from alcohol and the blow he had received, looked around in growing desperation as he realized that the crowd's sympathy was shifting away from him. He made one final, desperate attempt to rally support, offering to increase his bid and promising entertainment for any who wanted to witness what he planned to do with his purchases. But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears. The spell of mob mentality had been broken by Daniel's courage and Harrison's moral leadership. What had seemed like acceptable entertainment just minutes before now appeared in its true light as unconscionable barbarism. The auctioneer, sensing the changing mood and fearing for his own safety, began to back away from the platform. He had conducted such sales before in other towns, but he had never encountered resistance like this. His usual patter about market dynamics and commercial necessity fell flat in the face of growing moral outrage. More voices joined the chorus of opposition. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, one of the few women in town with the education and social standing to speak with authority, stepped forward to examine Sarah and Mary's condition. Her medical assessment revealed evidence of mistreatment that further inflamed the crowd's sense of injustice. The momentum had shifted completely. What had begun as Daniel Morrison's solitary stand against evil had become a community reckoning with its own moral failures. The auction was not just stopped but thoroughly repudiated, with several prominent citizens demanding investigations into how such events had been allowed to occur in the first place. Brennan and his men found themselves increasingly isolated as former supporters melted away into the crowd. The drunk man's threats and bluster now seemed pathetic rather than intimidating, the ravings of a man whose power had evaporated in the face of united opposition. The bonds holding Sarah and Mary were cut by willing hands, their immediate physical needs tended to by women who had found their voices and their consciences. The two sisters, still traumatized but no longer helpless victims, were taken to the safety of Dr. Carter's clinic for proper medical attention and care. Daniel Morrison, battered and bloodied but victorious, accepted the rough congratulations of men who had found their courage in his example. But he took no satisfaction in the violence that had been necessary to achieve this result. Instead, he focused on the larger victory, the transformation of a community that had been willing to tolerate evil into one that would actively resist it. The aftermath of that day's events rippled through Millfield, like stones thrown into still water, creating circles of change that expanded far beyond the town square where the confrontation had taken place. Within hours, news of Daniel Morrison's stand had spread to every corner of the community, carried by witnesses who struggled to put into words what they had experienced. Some spoke of shame and redemption, others of courage and transformation, but all agreed that something fundamental had shifted in the moral landscape of their frontier town. The auction block was torn down before sunset, its destruction serving as a powerful symbol of the community's commitment to a different path forward. The work was done not by official decree but by volunteers who appeared with hammers and crowbars, their faces grim with determination. As the platform was reduced to splinters and kindling, a crowd gathered to watch its destruction, many of the same people who had gathered earlier to witness human suffering now present to witness its symbolic rejection. The wood was piled high in the center of the square and set ablaze as darkness fell, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like fingers of purification. People stood around the fire in contemplative silence, each wrestling with their own thoughts about what had transpired and what it meant for their future. Children who had witnessed the day's events asked questions their parents struggled to answer, forcing adults to confront the moral complexities of frontier life in ways they had long avoided. Local laws were strengthened in the days that followed, not through the action of distant territorial authorities, but through the collective will of citizens who had rediscovered their capacity for moral leadership. A committee was formed to ensure that the rights of all people, regardless of race or circumstance, would be protected within the town's borders. The committee included not just the prominent citizens like Tom Harrison and Dr. Elizabeth Carter, but also ordinary folks like Daniel Morrison, who had proven that moral courage could emerge from the most unexpected sources. The new regulations were comprehensive and specific, addressing not just the trade in human beings but the broader culture of exploitation that had allowed such practices to flourish. Penalties were established for those who would prey upon the vulnerable, and mechanisms were created to provide aid and protection for those who found themselves without resources or advocates. Most importantly, the regulations established a principle that would guide the community's future development. That prosperity built on the suffering of others was no prosperity at all. Sarah and Mary Running Deer were not simply abandoned to fend for themselves after their rescue, as might have happened in less enlightened circumstances. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, working with other concerned citizens, took personal responsibility for their welfare and recovery. The sisters were housed in the doctor's own home, where they received not just medical attention for their physical injuries, but also the emotional support necessary to begin healing from their trauma. The process of helping them return to their people was complex and delicate, requiring careful negotiation with Apache leaders who had little reason to trust white officials or institutions. Dr. Carter, assisted by a local missionary who had learned some Apache language and customs, worked tirelessly to establish contact with the sisters' surviving relatives. Letters were written and carried by trusted intermediaries. Arrangements were made for safe passage through territory controlled by hostile forces, and guarantees were secured that the women would face no retribution for their capture or the circumstances of their rescue. The negotiations took weeks, during which Sarah and Mary remained in Millfield, slowly recovering their strength and beginning to trust that their ordeal was truly over. Their presence in the community served as a daily reminder of the events that had transformed the town, and their gradual healing became a source of inspiration for others who were struggling with their own moral reckonings. During their stay, the sisters shared stories of their people's culture and traditions with those who showed genuine interest and respect. They taught Dr. Carter and other women traditional Apache methods of plant medicine, while sharing their knowledge of the natural world and their people's relationship with the land. These exchanges helped humanize the Apache in the eyes of Millfield's residents, breaking down stereotypes and prejudices that had made their exploitation possible in the first place. Daniel Morrison remained in Millfield, but as a fundamentally changed man. The physical wounds from his confrontation with Brennan's men healed within weeks, but the spiritual transformation he had undergone that day in the town square would last for the rest of his life. His carpentry business prospered, not just because of his skill with tools, but because of the respect he had earned through his moral courage. People sought him out not just for his craftsmanship, but for his counsel, recognizing in him a man who had proven himself capable of doing the right thing when it mattered most. But Daniel never sought recognition for his role in the day that everything changed. When visitors to the town asked about the events, he deflected credit to others and insisted that anyone would have done the same thing under the circumstances. His humility was genuine, born from the understanding that heroism was not about special qualities or exceptional bravery, but about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when faced with moral clarity. He became a leader in the community's ongoing efforts to establish justice and protect the vulnerable, though he always worked behind the scenes rather than seeking public positions or official authority. His workshop became an informal gathering place, where problems were discussed and solutions developed, where disputes were mediated and consensus built. The same qualities that had driven him to stand up to an angry mob proved valuable in the quieter work of building a just community. The story of the Apache sisters and the man who stood up for them spread throughout the territory like wildfire, carried by travelers and traders who had heard the tale in Millfield saloons and shops. Each telling added new details and interpretations, but the core message remained constant, that ordinary people, when they found the courage to act on their convictions, could indeed change the world around them. Other communities began to examine their own practices and attitudes, inspired by Millfield's example to confront their own moral failures. Some towns passed similar legislation protecting the vulnerable, while others simply began the slower process of cultural change that would eventually lead to greater justice and compassion. The ripple effects continued to expand, reaching places and people that Daniel Morrison would never know about, proving that courage, like evil, was contagious and that one person's stand could inspire countless others. Jake Brennan left Millfield the morning after his humiliation in the town square, his reputation in ruins and his welcome thoroughly worn out. He slipped away before dawn like the coward he had always been beneath his bullying exterior, taking with him only what he could carry and leaving behind debts and enemies that would follow him wherever he went. He was never again able to conduct his vile business with the same impunity, as word of his true nature preceded him wherever he went, like a dark cloud that no amount of money or bluster could dispel. The frontier could be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it had no tolerance for those who preyed upon the innocent once their actions were brought into the full light of public scrutiny. Brennan found himself unwelcome in town after town, his presence alone enough to turn decent people against any establishment that would harbor him. Within a year, reports reached Millfield that he had met his end in a saloon fight in a mining camp, dying as he had lived, violently, meaninglessly, and utterly alone. His followers and enablers scattered like roaches when the light is turned on, some disappearing into the vast anonymity of the frontier, others attempting to reinvent themselves in distant communities where their pasts were unknown. But the lesson of their downfall was not lost on others who might have been tempted to follow similar paths. The balance of power in frontier society had shifted, even if only slightly, in favor of those who valued human dignity over personal profit. Years later, when historians and journalists began to document the transformation of the American West, from lawless frontier to settled civilization, they would note the events in Millfield as a small but significant example of how communities could change for the better. It marked a moment when the better angels of human nature triumphed over baser instincts, when ordinary people found the courage to stand up for what was right despite the personal cost. The lesson of that day echoed through generations like a stone thrown into still water, its ripples spreading far beyond their point of origin. It became a reminder that evil triumphs only when good people remain silent, that courage is contagious when one person is willing to take the first stand, and that the moral arc of history bends toward justice only when individuals are willing to grab hold of it and pull with all their strength. In the end, it was not the power of institutions or the wisdom of leaders that saved Sarah and Mary running deer. It was the decision of one ordinary man to stop being ordinary, to step outside his comfort zone and risk everything for strangers who could offer him nothing in return except the knowledge that he had done the right thing when it mattered most. And in that decision, he discovered not just his own capacity for heroism, but the capacity for heroism that exists within every human heart, waiting for the right moment to emerge and change the world.